Today, we're tackling a really important piece of analysis. It's titled Us Thon Halekalo Selgo.
Right, which translates to Iran, the mission curbing the nuclear challenge, and regional entrenchment.
Exactly. It's a report from 2022 put together by Simon Schein, Roz Zimt, Ephraim Askilai, Sarah Lair Zilberberg, and Yuval Riman.
A strong team.
Definitely. And it really digs into Iran's nuclear program, its growing influence across the Middle East, and what all this means for Israel's strategy.
Yeah, you shared this because it's crucial to cut through the daily headlines and understand the deeper complexities, right? Iran's position, the strategic dilemmas.
Precisely. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack the main findings from that 2022 report, lay out the key facts, and sort of connect the dots on this pretty intricate situation.
Sounds good. So we'll cover their nuclear progress, regional moves, internal issues.
The conflict with Israel and the strategic options on the table. Basically giving everyone a clear, insightful view of what's really at stake.
Okay, let's jump in. Where should we start? The nuclear program seems like the obvious place.
Agreed. So the report highlights some really rapid advancements, especially after the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal.
Absolutely. It's striking. The report basically says that by 2022, Iran had hit what they call threshold state status.
Okay, threshold state. Can you break that down for us? What does that actually mean in simple terms?
Sure. It means they got to a point where they had the knowledge, the technical capability, and the materials to build a nuclear explosive device relatively quickly.
How quickly are we talking?
The estimate back then, in 2022, was potentially within a couple of years to get a deliverable warhead.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just theory. They were actively enriching uranium at 2 sites and to pretty high levels.
High levels. Alarmingly high, the report suggests.
Yeah. They had enough fissile material enriched to various levels for about 4 explosive devices. But here's the kicker.
Uh-oh.
That material could potentially be boosted to weapons grade, like 90% enrichment, in just a matter of weeks.
Weeks? Wow, that's a really tight timeline. Doesn't leave much room for maneuver.
Exactly. It drastically shrinks any window for intervention.
And it wasn't just the enriched uranium itself, was it? There were other developments raising red flags.
Right. They were running thousands of centrifuges, including advanced models. Think of these like supercharged washing machines for separating uranium isotopes. The advanced ones do it much, much faster.
Okay, speeding up the whole process.
Significantly. Plus, they were working on uranium metal processing at Esfahan. Now, that's a big step because uranium metal is what you'd actually use in the core of a weapon. It's moving beyond just enrichment towards, well, bomb-making material.
Got it. And all this was happening with, let's say, less than ideal international supervision.
That's putting it mildly. The report points to really limited and partial international monitoring. Plus, there was this ongoing fight with the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog.
About those undeclared sites.
Precisely. Where they found traces of uranium that Iran hadn't declared. That's a direct violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. And Iran wasn't being fully cooperative, which obviously raises huge questions about transparency.
So the bottom line on the nuclear front in 2022, rapid progress, getting dangerously close to a breakout capability, and serious concerns about transparency.
That sums it up pretty well. A sobering picture.
Okay, so holding that thought, let's pivot to Iran's regional activities. The report describes them constantly working to cement their influence, right? Where were the main focuses?
Yeah, this is the other key pillar. It's about building this network, this axis of resistance. The report highlights Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and the Gaza Strip as key zones. And they also have ambitions in Judea and Samaria.
It's about projecting power and creating strategic depth.
Exactly. It's crucial for their security calculus.
And it's more than just political influence, isn't it? The report mentions sophisticated weapons transfers.
Yes, and what's interesting is their adaptability. They're not just shipping weapons, they're transferring advanced tech and know-how.
Helping proxies build their own stuff.
Correct. They're helping groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and factions in Gaza set up local weapons production. Think drones, missiles.
That makes it much harder to stop, I imagine. Less reliant on direct shipments.
Much harder. It creates a more resilient, distributed threat network.
And the report also points to how much sway pro-Iranian groups have inside countries like Iraq and Lebanon.
Absolutely. In both places, these factions are major political players. The report notes they're often kingmakers, It's tough to form a stable government without their buy-in.
And the Iraqi government formed in 2022 under al-Sudani.
Generally seen as closer to Tehran than the previous one, potentially strengthening Iran's hand there.
Okay, so a strong regional presence. Now, let's look outward. The report noted some significant shifts in Iran's international relationships, particularly with Russia and the Ukraine war.
Yeah, this was a big one. An unprecedented level of alignment with Russia. Iran wasn't just offering diplomatic support. They were actively supplying drones.
The Shahed drones we heard so much about.
Exactly. Sending experts to help operate them, and even talking about setting up joint production lines in Russia for drones and maybe even ballistic missiles.
That's a massive development. Did that change how other international players saw Iran?
It certainly did. NATO, for the first time, explicitly called Iran part of the European security challenge because of this. They told Iran to stop arming Russia.
So a clear pivot towards that eastern axis, Russia and China.
Definitely. The report connects this to the strengthening of hardline conservatives inside Iran. These are groups who were always skeptical of the West, opposed to reviving the nuclear deal.
Right, so this alignment fits their worldview.
Perfectly. They see it as boosting Iran's standing, providing a buffer against Western pressure, maybe even an opportunity.
An opportunity for what? Weapons, economic benefits.
Both, potentially. A chance to get advanced Russian weapons they couldn't otherwise access, and also finding ways around sanctions through trade in local currencies, barter deals, that sort of thing.
Okay, so projecting power externally, forging new alliances. But internally, the report paints a picture of significant turmoil back in 2022.
Oh, absolutely. The protests that kicked off in September 2022, the report calls them the biggest challenge to the regime's stability since the revolution in '79.
Bigger than previous protests, what was different?
The focus. Earlier protests were often about economic stuff, prices, jobs. These were deeply political, anti-regime. People weren't just asking for reforms. They were challenging the whole system, its legitimacy.
The fundamental challenge.
Yes. And the regime, despite its security forces, really struggled to shut it down completely.
Did the report think the protests could actually topple the regime?
It concluded that at that time, the protesters probably didn't have the organization to actually overthrow the government.
Yeah.
But, and this is key, the underlying issues weren't going away.
You mean the public dissatisfaction, the social changes the regime ignores?
Exactly. So the potential for more unrest, maybe even escalating, seemed very high.
And all this was happening alongside a pretty brutal economic crisis, right? Despite their resistance economy rhetoric.
Precisely. The economy was in bad shape, and the report expected it to get worse. Think ongoing sanctions, maybe even tighter ones, plus the economic hit from the protests themselves, property damage, the internet shutdowns hurting businesses.
Inflation was already high.
Yeah, around 45% in 2022. And huge price jumps for basic goods after they messed with the exchange rate for food imports.
Ouch. And the government budget.
A major deficit, partly because they had to pay out subsidies after that exchange rate change. And this deficit was happening even though oil revenues had actually gone up a bit.
How come? Higher oil prices from the Ukraine war.
Mostly, yeah. And maybe slightly looser sanctions enforcement, especially on sales to China. Although later, Russia started undercutting them by selling discounted oil to China too. So it wasn't a simple picture.
But the deficit still hurt long-term prospects.
Definitely. It meant less money for essential infrastructure investment, which you need for growth. The World Bank was forecasting really sluggish growth, like 2%, which means more unemployment, especially for young people.
And the currency, the real.
Still plummeting, reaching record lows. So you have this toxic mix: high youth unemployment, terrible economic conditions, deep anti-regime feelings, all fueling that unrest.
A really volatile internal situation, which of course connects to the ongoing conflict with Israel. The report makes it clear how Iran views Israel.
Yeah, unequivocally as the #1 threat to their national security. They see Israel as the main driver of conflicts affecting their regional presence, especially in Syria, and also behind covert actions inside Iran itself.
Stuff Iran blames on Israel anyway.
Right, which Israel typically neither confirms nor denies. But that perception drives a lot of Iranian strategy. It's this deep-seated rivalry, this shadow war.
And according to the report, Iran hadn't really found a good answer to Israeli actions, particularly in Syria.
That was the assessment in 2022. They'd tried things attacking ships, cyber attacks, encouraging militias to hit U.S. forces. But none of it seemed to really deter Israel's strikes in Syria, the so-called Mabam campaign.
Mabam, the campaign between wars.
Exactly. Iran's attempts to retaliate elsewhere, like in Iraqi Kurdistan, were also pretty limited. partly because they didn't want to destabilize the Iraqi government too much.
Interesting. The report also mentions rising tensions with Azerbaijan. Why was that?
Because Azerbaijan was getting closer to Israel. Sharing a long border with Iran, Azerbaijan's warming ties with Israel made Tehran really nervous.
Worried about intelligence gathering, maybe staging grounds.
That kind of thing, yeah. Iran made public threats, held military drills near the border, but Azerbaijan went ahead anyway and announced they were opening an embassy in Israel in late 2022.
So Iran saw this, plus the Abraham Accords, as Israel trying to encircle them.
Kind of a mirror image of Iran's own strategy of building its proxy network around Israel. They saw Israel try and do the same thing to them.
Okay, so given that whole complex picture, the nuclear progress, the regional moves, the internal instability, the conflict with Israel, what did the report see as the main strategic challenges for Israel?
Several big ones. In the nuclear arena, the main challenge was this feeling that there wasn't an immediate, effective response to Iran's rapid progress, compounded by the sense that the U.S. and Europe weren't paying enough attention at that moment.
A sense of urgency in Israel wasn't matched elsewhere.
That seems to be the implication. And regionally, the Mabam campaign in Syria, while having some success, wasn't fully stopping weapons transfers. Hezbollah and Lebanon still posed a major deterrent threat.
And the situation in Iraq.
A pro-Iranian government there, viewing militias as part of its security setup that complicated things. Plus, Iran kept trying to stir up trouble in Judea and Samaria via groups like Islamic Jihad.
The report also seemed a bit critical of Israel's overall policy stance at the time.
It pointed out some potential gaps. Israel was opposing any return to the old nuclear deal, demanding a longer and stronger one that Iran wouldn't accept, while also talking up an independent military option and pushing the U.S. for stronger deterrence.
What was the gap?
Well, Israel doesn't ultimately control whether there's a deal or what's in it. The longer, stronger deal looked unrealistic. And the U.S. timeline for considering military action seemed different from Israel's perceived window of urgency.
So the conclusion was that Israel lacked a clear answer if Iran just kept progressing.
Essentially, yes. Iran kept moving closer to that breakout capability, and Israel seemed stuck without a guaranteed way to stop it, short of Iran itself deciding not to cross the final line.
Which leads to the question of alternative strategies. What options did the report lay out for Israel, particularly on the nuclear front?
It presented some pretty stark choices. One, basically learn to live with Iran as a threshold state, maybe even eventually a nuclear weapons state. That's hugely destabilizing, of course.
Not ideal. What else?
Two, ramp up covert actions, sabotage, cyber attacks, anything to delay the program further.
Keep throwing wrenches in the works.
Right. And three, seriously prepare an independent military option, potentially usable within a year or two from 2022.
A military strike. But the report wasn't convinced any of these guaranteed success.
No. It included a sobering note that none of these options could absolutely ensure Iran wouldn't get the bomb eventually.
So given those difficult options, what did the report recommend for the nuclear arena?
It proposed a kind of layered strategy. First, push diplomatically for the U.S. and Europe to declare the old deal dead and trigger snapback sanctions at the UN Security Council.
Get those tough international sanctions back in place.
Exactly. Second, work out a detailed joint plan with the U.S., and ideally the U.K., France, and Germany too, on exactly how to respond to specific Iranian escalations. Agree on secret red lines.
Coordinate responses. Makes sense.
Third, keep up the covert actions, focusing on things that would cause the biggest delays. Fourth, continue developing that independent military option. Make it credible.
So diplomacy, coordination, covert action, and military readiness.
And fifth, really tighten the screws on sanctions enforcement, especially oil exports. But also go beyond economic stuff. Diplomatic isolation, like kicking them out of UN bodies, sports events, travel bans for officials, and disrupt their efforts to buy dual-use tech.
A comprehensive pressure campaign.
That's the idea.
Okay. And what about recommendations for the regional front? Countering Iran's influence and proxies.
Several things there, too. First, keep up the Mabam strikes in Syria and covert ops inside Iran, targeting the Revolutionary Guards, missile programs, drone stuff, anything enabling regional entrenchment.
Keep disrupting the network.
Right. Second, boost intelligence sharing and operational cooperation with Gulf states. Help them defend against Iranian drones and missiles, working with the U.S., but being mindful of their concerns about Iranian retaliation.
Building a regional counter-Iran coalition, essentially.
In a practical sense,
Yeah.
Third, leverage the improved ties with Turkey to explore cooperation against Iran, maybe in Syria or even Iraq.
Interesting.
Fourth, Use Iran's military aid to Russia as leverage. Get the West to put more pressure, including sanctions, specifically on the IRGC and Iran's drone and missile industries.
Turn their alignment with Russia against them.
And finally, work closely with the U.S. and Gulf partners in CENTCOM's Task Force 153, that's the Maritime Security Group, to block Iran from shipping weapons by sea.
Okay, so a lot to digest there. Let's try to summarize the main takeaways for everyone listening. This 2022 report basically showed an Iran making rapid, worrying nuclear advances,
while also persistently pushing its regional influence through proxies and advanced weapons.
and simultaneously facing major internal instability and economic problems. A really volatile mix.
Definitely. And the report highlights the huge challenges this poses for Israel. The recommended path wasn't simple. It was this multi-layered strategy involving international diplomacy, sanctions, covert action, regional partnerships, and military preparedness.
Yeah, no silver bullets on offer.
Yeah.
Understanding these dynamics from 2022, though, it gives crucial context for making sense of Middle East geopolitics today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That potential for rapid nuclear escalation, the constant regional friction, it really underscores why this issue remains so critical.
So maybe a final thought to leave our listeners with, considering those internal pressures inside Iran, the protests, the economy, how might those domestic issues ultimately play out?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Could that internal instability force the regime to de-escalate, to focus inward? Or could it actually push them to be more aggressive externally, to rally support or distract from problems at home?
A critical uncertainty, something definitely worth keeping an eye on as things continue to evolve.